Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. I'm just posting, making sure that this link is set up in our meetup group so that everyone has it. I think I posted it earlier, but I just wanted to double, triple check and make sure that it's um, right where it needs to be. So you can use the live chat on the side there to like ask questions or share experiences or however you want to. Um, so however you want to do it. But tonight I thought we'd talk about what is trauma, what that means physically for us, if some trauma is more traumatic, if there's some type of hierarchy in the trauma scale of things or not. The short answer is no, but we'll get to that. So what exactly is trauma? So trauma is basically an event or a situation that happens. We perceive it, we interpret it, and then we attach an emotion to it. And it's usually not so much the trauma itself or the event or the situation that is so antagonizing for us and painful and causes us suffering. It's the aftermath of that event due to the importance and the emotional connection that we place upon it or that we have on it. So that's kind of what it is in a nutshell. There's no real or hierarchy. There's not one trauma that's less or worse than the other. I mean, obviously, we hear of traumatic events, and maybe a sexual assault may be more traumatic than being slapped in the face or something of that nature. But trauma, what we know scientifically, trauma is 100% perceived. So if I call person a jerk on the playground, and person A is like, okay, no big deal, whatever. If I say to person B that they're a jerk, they might take that very personally and perceive that as a traumatic event. Same situation, same scenario, same words, same verbiage, same tone of voice, everything could be the same, but it's two different individuals and they can perceive that entirely differently. And it's dependent upon the person and it's how we perceive that. And of course, there are environmental factors, familial factors, things like that that set us up for traumatic events or to perceive things as traumatic events as opposed to other people. There is a theory out there that says that if you have like a good, strong family bond and good social upbringing, as far as like having several positive support systems and things like that, that you are less prone to perceive like things like name calling and things like that as traumatic if you have a good, healthy sense of self and self esteem. Still being studied. So we'll see. At any rate, so it's really the emotional charge that we give to it. It's not so much the event, it's the attachment that we have to that event, and it's the emotional attachment. So if we perceive it as positive, that can be a good thing, and not necessarily a traumatic event being positive. But if we attach an overwhelming positive emotion to an event that happens, like at a birthday or a celebration of some sorts, that can be something that plays in the back of our mind all the time in the same way, the exact same way as a traumatic event plays in the back of our mind all the time because we've given it that negative charge or that negative emotion that we've attached to it. So pretty much the same. It's the attachment to the distressing thoughts and memories, really, that kind of overwhelm us. And part of the reason is because we'll get into this here in a moment, but it's the way that the brain processes trauma and handles it. So, like I said, an event happens or a situation occurs, we perceive it, we interpret it, and then we decide, excuse me, and we attach the emotion to it. So, when an event happens, we're going to talk about what happens in the brain when this situation or this event occurs and why it's the emotions that keep us playing. The short answer is it basically hijacks the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of our brain that tells us that an event is done, it's past, it's over, it's a memory. When we have a traumatic event or situation occur, that part of the brain gets overacted, overstimulated due to a lot of different hormones, etc., which we'll discuss as well. But in short, that part of the brain gets hijacked, for lack of a better term. And it is extremely difficult to reset that back. This is what happens with PTSD or flashbacks or night terrors, things like that. That part of the brain gets activated again, and the hippocampus in the middle of the brain that tells us, oh, that's in the past, it's done. That part of the brain doesn't get the message that we are not reliving that is in the past, that already happened. So when you have a flashback or a PTSD episode or a panic attack, for example, our brain thinks that's happening in real time. We don't understand that already occurred and that situation is done. So the brain sort of sets you back up for this over and over again. So trauma and relationships is another big one. It becomes very closely intertwined in several of our relationships. And then we can even seek out relationships that sort of re-trigger or re-traumatize us in order to subconsciously give ourselves like a second chance to reprocess things. Sometimes we will seek out someone who reminds us of a person that was abusive or that traumatized us in order to kind of redo things, so to speak, and perceive it differently, interpret it differently, and sort of digest it very differently. And that's why we kind of subject ourselves to similar situations too. So not just with people, but also if you have a very stressful job, for instance, or soldiers going away to war that keep getting deployed over and over, or signing up for deployments, I should say, you sort of kind of create this roundabout cyclical pattern, for lack of a better term. So in neuroscience, they say that trauma is the attachment, and the attachment that involves the sympathetic nervous system. So this is the hypervigilance of our amygdala and our limbic system. And an amygdala is a different part of the brain. Our limbic system is the part of the brain that governs emotions. And what that does, like I was saying, that disables the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the part of the brain responsible for telling us that an event is past and it's over. So the attachment that involves the sympathetic, the fight or flight nervous system there sort of gets hijacked, and you get that hypervigilance. A lot of trauma survivors have this hypervigilance, which is basically you're always on edge. You're always ready. Like you're always ready for fight or flight. Everything is pretty black and white too. There's very little gray area. So chemically, what that does inside the body is the stress from all of this, because fight or flight, the way our bodies are set up biologically, is if we're getting chased by, a large animal, by a bear or a mountain lion or, I don't know, rhinoceros, whatever it is, a saber-toothed tiger, a woolly mammoth, whatever it was back in the day, that we do activate the part of our brain that helps us survive. And by doing so, you start releasing a ton of hormones in the body. And basically, these hormones give you the maximum amount of energy so that you can run or you can fight. So one of the two is going to be your best bet for survival. So when you have a traumatic event happen, that system gets activated. That part of the brain gets hijacked into thinking that it's still occurring, it hasn't ended, and you live in this perpetual state of fight or flight. Whether or not you're consciously aware of it, your body's still secreting, releasing those hormones, that adrenaline, that norepinephrine, cortisol. Cortisol is a big one. Cortisol is the big stress hormone. So basically what it does is it increases the cortisol level. Cortisol is fine in short term, but we just don't want this to continue on long term. And long term meaning years, months. So, shorter than that, your body is meant to kind of readjust and handle it. But what happens a lot of times is we live in that perpetual state. So a lot of people end up getting what they call adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout. Some doctors believe in that, some don't. I'll let you draw your own conclusions on it. I personally think it's a real thing. Your adrenal glands are the ones that are responsible for secreting all those hormones. And if they're constantly secreting these hormones, it makes sense to me that they might get kind of drained or burn out. So glutamate, adrenaline get released. Glutamate is involved in brain function and myelin sheath function. It'll decrease your GABA, your GABA, which helps with healthy brain cell function. And it will decrease the serotonin, which is the hormone involved in the level of happiness. So a lot of people that have depression, these SSRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, these medications help increase or produce synthetic or unnatural forms of serotonin in the body to help decrease depression so that you can kind of alleviate that feeling of sadness, chronic sadness. So when we're living in this hypervigilant state of fight or flight, then we start to internalize things if we don't process them. So when you have any of that happen and you have perceived it, you've interpreted it, you've attached an emotion to it, There are two different types of emotional experiences. There's a complete emotional experience or an incomplete emotional experience. So in a complete emotional experience, we allow ourselves to feel the feelings and we do what we need to do to process them, and then we just sort of move on with it. In an incomplete emotional experience, is basically you kind of shut down. You don't allow yourself to feel things. You kind of block it out. You numb yourself, whatever that is for you, but you don't allow yourself to kind of feel those things in your body. So then you start to internalize it in the body. Then it can get stuck sort of in fascia, in muscle tissue, in cells, and etc. When our ego gets involved, because with a lot of traumatic events like abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, even PTSD from war and things like that, there's a lot of shame and guilt involved. So that can absolutely affect our ego. And when our ego gets involved, then it starts to interfere with our spiritual connection, whatever that looks like for you, whether that's, through church or through meditation or whatever that is for you. This energetic attachment can lead to a block or an imbalance. What this does is our bodies produce an electromagnetic frequency all the time. And by creating a block or an imbalance or a place where we've blocked or shut down those emotions that we chose not to process, that creates sort of a disturbance in that electromagnetic field, so to speak. So it will then affect the nervous system. Scar tissue is kind of a form of that. I'm not saying that you will develop scar tissue from trauma. I'm just saying scar tissue is an example of how the body can form extra tissue to sort of protect itself, so to speak, from a traumatic event, which surgery is a traumatic event. It's an invasive procedure. And the body interprets that as trauma typically. And it will form scar tissue there to kind of form an extra layer of protection. Sometimes that can be a bad thing because it can affect range of motion, movement, sensation, touch, feelings, things like that. So if that occurs, then that can be a negative thing, but that's one way in which it can affect the nervous system when it comes to that. So the key is to really get unstuck from our emotions. So if we are holding on to these things, to really get them moving again, get our emotions moving again. Whatever that looks like for you, whether that's drawing or journaling or painting or running around outside and screaming or going to the gym or whatever that is, that's the key. So cellular vibration is important in physical and mental health. So all of our cells, like I was saying, have a frequency, voltage. And when the cell is decreased, the voltage of the cell is decreased, I believe it's by 40 millivolts, that's when illness can set in. So things like the common cold, the flu, things like that. So it just takes a tiny bit for it to become compromised, so to speak. So same thing with trauma. By not moving and releasing it, this can affect your cells and help your physical state, your mental state, things of that nature. We all have heard of people that have developed syndromes of fibromyalgia, chronic pain in certain areas, and things of that nature due to traumas or emotional blockages or things like that. So everything has a distinct vibration, whether that's healthy or unhealthy. And once you establish this normal energetic field, it tends to want to replicate itself. Like all of our cells will replicate and completely turn over within 7 years. Same thing with this electromagnetic or energetic field, if you will. So take into consideration memories, thoughts, feelings that you've had all your life. Are they predominantly positive? Are they predominantly negative? Are they predominantly love-based or fear-based? All of that tends to want to replicate itself. So if you want to kind of create something new for yourself, you need to take that into consideration. Are most of my thought processes fear-based, or are most of them love-based, or do I have a lot of bad memories or a lot of good memories? And that's what's going to tend to replicate itself. So I think it was the late 70s, maybe early 80s, there were some researchers in France that discovered meridians on the body, which is what the ancient Chinese have known for a long time. Meridians are just like lines on the body of lowered electrical resistance. And so this is kind of where acupuncture comes into play. They believe that by disturbing or disrupting that field, that it can help restore the flow of chi or energy or prana, or restore the body to like a normal flow, if you will, for lack of a better term. So for me personally, learning information like this was beneficial because if I could sort of, as an outsider, objectively understand what was happening in my body in my brain, what was happening on a chemical level, on a physical level, on an emotional level, it made things easier for me to understand. It's not the case with everyone, but for me personally, that's what worked. Um, and then I can start to sort of shift my thinking for me. So keys for trauma, the big secret is basically to remove the emotional charge. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, doesn't mean it wasn't shitty, doesn't mean it wasn't awful, doesn't mean that you condone it. But if you remove the emotional charge from it, if you give it no more thought or emotion than what you had for lunch yesterday or putting your socks on in the morning, then it's not going to cause you to suffer. Because pretty much most schools of thought believe that it's not so much, like I said, the situation or the event of the trauma, it's the aftermath, it's the emotional attachment, it's the hijacking of our hippocampus that keeps us stuck in that way of thinking, that victim mentality, so to speak, sometimes. And remembering how horrible it was, how awful it was, how out of control we felt, or whatnot. That's what keeps us stuck. So once you start to remove that emotion that you have with it, which takes time, it's not easy, it doesn't happen overnight, then you start to shift the way that you think about it, and you start to shift your consciousness, for lack of a better term, and the way in which you perceive it and believe in it and allow it to continue to affect you, because it's not something that will go away. It's part of you, but you will decide how it's going to affect the rest of your life, whether that's you personally, your jobs, your careers, your relationships with other people, everything in your life. So trauma, I believe that information is in everything. Energy is just bits of information. Food is bits of energetic information that you put in your body. Trauma is an informative event. And unfortunately, most of the time it's negative. So if you think about, like, when your mom makes her special recipe, when your mom makes it, it tastes better because she puts her love into it. She puts part of her energy into it. When you make it, it doesn't taste as good. It's probably like, well, it's kind of close to mom's, but it's not as good as mom's. That's why, because mom is imparting her energy into it, or grandma, or whomever. And your energy is different than theirs, and that's why it's a little bit different. So when you think about with trauma, usually with a traumatic event, there's a lot of anger, violence, a lot of negative emotions and fear that get infused into that situation, which is why the aftermath of it and the emotions that come with it are so hard to shake and so difficult, because it wasn't that event was infused with nothing positive. So part of that person or that people or that situation that gets infused into the event and imparted into the energetic field of you and whomever else is involved in that, whether that's through a car wreck or a war or an assault, whatever that is. It could be pretty intense at times, depending on the person. So our bodies have the chance to heal themselves because our cells store a lot of information, and that includes the information that got imparted or infused during the event, but that also can be the information that you choose to infuse yourself with when you surround yourself with things, whether that is, taking care of yourself and doing the proper steps of, like, the 5 stages of grieving after trauma. Have you mourned the loss of whatever it is? Have you gone through those 5 stages? Have you talked to a qualified therapist or psychiatrist? Are you doing what you need to do to take care of yourself and sort of process those incomplete emotions into a complete emotional event? Because that's how you start to move things instead of holding on to them and bottling them up. So the informational field that we surround ourselves with too. I mean, if you're listening to I don't have a better example, but a lot of, like, rap music has very derogatory lyrics. If you're a woman who's been a victim of a sexual assault or domestic violence, that can be very triggering, and very, I guess triggering is a good word, but it can make you feel kind of just, So don't listen to things like that. Listen to things that are the opposite of that. Surround yourself with those things. The informational thought field, which has been studied and measured several times in science, is part of an actual physical reality. So are you surrounding yourself with people who believe your story, who validate you? Or are you constantly bombarded with like victim shaming, or people are like, oh, well, how bad is it? Oh, you've been back for a while. You need to get over that event. Or that happened when you were a kid. You need to move on. So people who are invalidating of your feelings versus people who are supportive and loving and nurturing, because their energetic field gets infused with yours as well. So all these subtle energies in our environment. So what happens when we get triggered with an event is basically there's usually a smell. One of our five senses gets triggered, whether that's whether something we see, we hear, we taste, we touch, we feel, whatever it is, that will bring us back to that moment. And when we get triggered, we are basically re-traumatizing ourselves. Our body releases the exact same chemicals as when the event really happened, and the hippocampus gets hijacked all over again and reinforced that, oh, this is really happening. The event isn't over. We're still living it. So that's what happens. So all that neurochemistry, the conscious, the unconscious, the behaviors, all get like stimulated big time when that happens. So the memory's the same, but the meaning has changed. That's what I'm talking about when we say that we want to release that emotional attachment to it. So how you view it, how you emotionally feel about it changes. That's kind of the end goal, if you will. A dissociation is a big thing that happens a lot, especially with childhood events or overwhelming events. A lot of times people will completely numb out or completely disassociate, almost like blacking out or having amnesia or not remember things very well, um, which is very common and very normal. And what happens is our brain takes the information that we have when we don't remember everything and we'll start to fill in pieces, which is why some people say that memory is tricky, because if we aren't witnessing the whole event, our brain will start to fill in parts of, well, I know that the room was this and there's a dining room table with this many chairs normally. So in the event, you may only remember 2 chairs, but your mind may fill in the fact that there are 4 chairs normally, so there had to have been 4 chairs in there. Just normal things like that our brain goes through on a normal basis, like the gas pedal on the car, the brake on the car. These are normal things that you may not remember in a traumatic event like a car crash, but they're habitual things that you will that your brain does kind of fill in for you so that you can kind of make sense of things, so to speak. But disassociation is very, very real. So the key with disassociation is to get the part of your body that numbs out when you disassociate or when you become numb. Notice where you feel it in your body. Sometimes it's the whole body, but 99% of the time it's a specific point or a specific area. And the key is to get the brain to reconnect to that part of the body. So doing something physical with that part of the body, whether that's holding a cold washcloth or a hot towel, or something tactile, like even like a dog toy, like those rubberized dog toys and things that are tactile, can help bring awareness or sensation to that part of the body, whether that's arms or hands, hips, back, whatever that is. That can kind of help sort of break that icebreaker, so to speak. So basically, in a nutshell, the other thing I want to really point out is that physical effects of trauma, if you haven't heard of them yet, the ACE studies, or the Adverse Childhood Events studies, you can Google it. It is basically a large study that is taken over by the CDC. It was started by Kaiser in California, but it's now taken over by the CDC, and I have another whole video on it. But it relates traumatic events in childhood, and it predicts whatever happens, however many traumatic events in childhood correlates with chronic disease in early adulthood. So people that are having heart attacks at 30, getting cancer in their 20s, things like that, because of the long-term stress and trauma early in life and not dealing, processing with emotions, that then this takes its toll. So things that normally shouldn't happen to your body until way later in life start to happen much earlier, just because of how it hijacks your brain, it hijacks your hormones, chemicals in your body, and can start to make you very acidic when you hold on to negative emotions, toxicity, the negative meaning that it lowers the electromagnetic field and vibration of your body. So I hope this was helpful. I appreciate you for joining, and I will post this link again. Thanks.